This is Julie Rickert from the Medical College of Wisconsin. Joining me is Thomas Bishop from the University of Michigan. Tom and I have had similar professional trajectories, starting in clinical practice before becoming family medicine educators. We even went through mid-career course corrections at the same time.
Mhm.
Tom is an energetic and engaging teacher. We have collaborated before and always enjoy catching up at STFM and the forum. I distinctly recall sitting with Tom between sessions and hearing about the behavioral science oral history project. The story is fascinating, and I am thrilled to share it with you today.
Hmm.
Welcome, Tom.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
So happy to have this.
Me too.
So, for those who have not heard of it, what is the Behavioral Science Oral History Project?
It's an idea that really grew out of my own sort of personal journey and reflection. I have found that my own story in life has been shaped by mentors. I'm really a reflection, probably like all of us, of people who've taken time to encourage me and to show me. And, I've kind of stumbled along in my career path into things because of others. And so in the last couple of chapters of my career, I really followed those that were moving more into the end of their career. They were retiring. So like when I was in Tennessee with Dr. Michael Floyd, he handed it off and I tried to fill his shoes as best as I could. And then being here in Michigan, I'm trying to follow Dr. Sam Romano. And so it's I began to think about those experiences and become to appreciate that the stories they have. It's the things that aren't found necessarily in the literature. It's not book chapters and articles, while those are great and tools and programs and conferences. But it's the story that they have that we are at risk of losing. So I started to think about how do we capture the stories of these folks before we don't have the opportunity. And I really believe, much like my life, the stories have an opportunity to teach us and show us a lot about how to be good clinicians and good teachers and good mentors and faculty. And so I wanted to sort of begin to look at that. And so with Julie Shermer, she said, "Why don't you do something with that?" And so that's kind of how the project developed, or where it came from. And that's how we got started.
I wonder how many of us can count back to either Julie Shermer or Dennis
Yeah,
Miller or Deb Taylor telling us, hey, you should do that.
that's right.
And what a great idea to make sure that their voices and stories are not lost.
Hmm.
So, on your team, who are some of the movers and shakers?
Certainly Julie Shermer. Deb Taylor was with us for a while, um, and then that changed a little bit. But then Dr. Fred Tudiver, if you know him, and then Dr. Michael Floyd. And you'll notice that a couple of them are from East Tennessee State University, where I was. If you know anything about the geography of East Tennessee State University, it's really in an area that is known for storytelling. The International Center for Storytelling is there. There's a rich culture. The university even has programming around that. And the work that Fred and Michael had done in the past is related to storytelling. And so it's natural that sort of this project has so much of those roots in it.
That is so interesting. Now, when you started to put the project together, you decided to classify a certain group of behavioral scientists as pioneers. Can you tell me a little bit about that?
It's important to understand that the project has sort of two parallel things taking place, if you will. And one of those is more of what would be a historical or journalistic endeavor. And really it's capturing the stories as much as we've just talked about. The other piece is being able to take what has been spoken in those interviews and those stories and sort of find the threads in there that teach us. And so that side of the project is a little more heavy in the sense that it started off with a Delphi study, because how do you determine who are the pioneers? Where do we start? How do you define them? Who's included? We started off having several, or I organized several focus groups at several of the STFM conferences, spring conferences in the forum and the like, and even one that was virtual, or two that were virtual. And it was literally our more senior, if I might say it that way, folks with lots of experience had kind of given input of names to include on that. And then we basically took those names in 2 or 3 cycles of Adelphi study to determine and whittle that list down to about 10 or 12.
Cool. And has your team drawn any conclusions yet?
There does seem to be a pretty cohesive story. I mean, in terms of things like serendipity is one, how folks sort of stumble into this kind of a role as behaviorists. And I think that's important to mention. This is the behavioral aspect of Society of Teachers of Family Medicine. It's this behavioral folks. And when you start hearing stories that folks sort of had, like you said, mentors or folks who kind of pulled them in. So there's, in terms of excitement, the energy, the willingness to be rebels and do things, and finding energy in that, and conferences and connections and relationships. All of these elements are in that kind of cohesive thing that we're only about halfway. And so that's what's taken so long. And certainly the last year has made it more interesting, but it takes time to travel and do these interviews and then decode them. And it's been a lot of fun in our Friday mornings. I call it the Friday morning with the crew. And those have been inspiring by themselves, to be honest with you.
Let's follow up on that. Like, what in particular about those Friday mornings do you love?
They occur, as you would imagine, throughout the seasons. And so sometimes the conversation will start by a seed of whatever's happening in each of our lives or what's happening around us. And then it starts to be a time of sort of hearing that and getting excited about it, and then unpacking whatever interviews and things we've been involved. So, the folks I work with have so much more history and understanding and appreciation of the individuals we're meeting with, or that I've been meeting with. And so they can give context to that. And pretty soon we have our own sort of journey into what it's like to be in this field of trying to bring up residents and work with others, and understanding how behavior is there, where the field is going. I'll tell you, I walk away feeling more energized for the work that I'm doing.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I would love, and I imagine people who are listening would love to hear any stories you have about your interviews.
Sure. I'll tell you, a time that stands out the most. Last summer was a particularly special time where my wife and I were able to travel out east. And I literally had worked for several months to organize this road trip, if you will. And we went from Michigan through Canada and stopped off in Rochester, and did a couple of interviews there with Dr. Tom Campbell and Dr. Ron Epstein. And it was amazing having lunch and just hearing about Rochester and how that program came about. And it was kind of special waiting around and then doing that, feeling a little nervous about it, and then thinking, who would meet with me? These folks have done a whole lot more, and yet it was very gracious, and I felt very much at home. And then we went off and met with Jerry Hepworth in Connecticut, and spent some time with her, and even had dinner with her on a lake there. And just that was one where she insisted that Barb come along, and we just had a nice evening of just talking about all kinds of things. And then heading up to Massachusetts and meeting with Sandy. And it was great. He was talking about some of the writing he'd been doing and where he was at this time of thinking. And it just, I just walked away from that one particularly energized. And then ending up with Julie for a few days. And I was able to sit on the deck with her. There's this infamous back deck where a lot of, as I understand them, these sorts of things were born out of. And to be able to be there was a nice culmination. And her and I spent several days writing the fellowships related to the project. And it was just a neat time of not only the interviews, but getting to know folks, kind of who they are, and um, yeah, that in particular was just a nice experience.
Wow. You know, I've always dreamed of being on Julie's back deck.
Hmm.
So, you know, you're talking about going out on the road and meeting people. And, you know, the big white elephant in the room is COVID. How has COVID affected your team?
Well, yeah, and it has a lot to the way we think about doing research, right? I mean, really, there's so much you can do virtually, even as we're doing this today. And there's a lot of ways to go back and forth through email and to work on our own things and bring them back together in conversations online and the like. But we had literally talked about meeting, I think it was in May. We were planning a location and a time that we were going to get together over a weekend, because so much of qualitative work has uh, you have to have the ability to toss around ideas and hear what each is noticing in the coding, and how do we understand the themes that are coming out of these discussions. And to be able to do that in person is so much more. I say more, maybe that's not fair. I guess it seems like it would be more advantageous to meet together and be able to do that over several hours in a couple of days or a long weekend. Um, and then we weren't able to do that. Um, and of course, our Friday mornings, you know, it certainly is on our mind and thinking about this time period, and probably not only COVID, but just a lot of unsettledness and uncertainty began to really get us thinking about the field we're in and what we're doing as behaviorists, and how are we supporting residents, and what's the other roles that are emerging perhaps, or deeper roles in the work that we do. Because again, the whole one of the purposes of collecting these interviews is to understand something about what it means to be faculty, you know, upholding the behavioral end of the curriculum. And so we've been thinking a lot about that. And even to the point where we began to consider, is our sample size, is it really reflective of um, of all the stories that need to be on the table? And so we began to consider who else we would interview, and are there other voices that we need to have in the discussion.
I know, and you've recently expressed concerns to me about representation of minorities.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. Exactly.
So, what other implications do your findings have for behavioral science education in family medicine?
Well, the hope is, right, that we come out with um, a set of themes and things that will help prepare those coming behind. It's literally, we're kind of coming full circle, as people have given me a hand and have, and us, you know, as we were talking, we each have folks that mentored and brought us along. Is there a way then to help those that come behind, and maybe give them a hand up in speed them along in the learning curve of becoming great clinicians and great teachers? And you know, so some of the themes that we've been looking at is just the importance of the developmental curve. You know, there seems to be this push pull kinds of things that happen in the lives of those that we've interviewed, and you can see that. You know, what factors help um, open up opportunities, and what things could get in the way of those. We've been talking about the different changes in curriculum focus, and you know, where there was a pretty big revolution at the beginning of like the psychosocial aspects, and even psychosocial medicine, if we want to call it that, and I think it had been called, and then moving into more family systems. And then we've kind of, I think the story ebbs and flows to where there was a more integration, and now there's a talk more about, do we bring more family systems back in? And I mean, where that is, and you'll see that development kind of go up and down and progress. And are there certain characteristics that help um, us to do better at what we're doing? And so we've been looking at that. The hope would be is to sort of take what we're learning, and then help that to frame some specific recommendations or thoughts about what things would be helpful. And while that feels a little loose yet because we're halfway, um, I, I, I really feel that there's some great threads emerging that we're going to build upon.
So I couldn't help but think as you were talking about how many challenges I have to get a full breadth of proposals for the forum every year. So for example, I am always looking for family systems presentations to include. And I'm not getting very many of those these days. What ideas, if any, do you have about ways to bring in that full breadth of topics in our younger colleagues?
Three things come to mind. One of those is that those of us that are further down the path need to be intentional to encourage and mentor those behind us. And so it may be in which brings to the second thing, being intentional. I think it's not good enough to be at conferences and things and sort of communicate about those things. I think it's to target folks that you can actually encourage and nurture along into doing that, and maybe even doing it with them. I think, your and I's story is a bit of that, where when we kind of decide to do things together, and so it might be those of us on one end of the career path saying to those below, how can we do these together? I'll collaborate with you. So building collaborations and things. Um, and then the third thing I think is those coming along need to be willing to step out of their box. What is it? I think Deb Taylor always said, be willing to say yes, right? Is that the?
Yes.
Yeah. And so taking the risks and to doing it. I think in all the stories we've heard, um, it was the idea of being at the conferences and being at retreats and being alongside others. And so there's a kind of a tension between serendipity and then the tension between having some intentionality of actually collaborating. Um, some said that it was the opportunity to write with others they would have never imagined, but they were asked to come along. And out of that became several other steps to grow what they were doing and to become stronger teachers.
Yeah, I definitely feel like in my own career that invitation
Mm-hmm.
to do things, to be part of the wiki, to be part of writing an article, or to partner with somebody else on a project. All of those things were so important to me when I was new and my imposter syndrome was really bad.
Yeah.
And I'm looking for all of those ways that I can serve, and that all of us mid careers can step into those roles that our
Mm-hmm.
seniors really did a great job of modeling.
Right.
Now, this project is ongoing. What are the next steps for you?
Well, there are several. We're continuing to code our interviews. So that's ongoing. As we talked a little bit earlier, we're reaching out and still doing interviews. And so we're expanding our scope a little bit and inviting others or pursuing others to see if they're willing to be a part of the project. We've actually been started off in writing, and or I have anyway, in a couple of directions, but felt like we still didn't quite have enough yet to kind of to step out on. And I really feel like we're getting close to that, because as I said, there are two sort of parallel things happening. And the journalistic side of telling the story a little bit, just telling stories, I'm sorry. We've began to think about that, maybe even in themes of like leadership and the like. What are some specific things that we're hearing in stories about leadership? But that's all kind of reflective writing, if you will. I don't know the better term. And then the other side of that is once we get through the next 4 or 5 interviews, we'll have enough to start writing more about the study, the Delphi, and the qualitative research that we're doing.
Oh, I'm sure we'll all be looking forward to all of those.
Mm-hmm.
What advice do you have for others who may be considering non traditional scholarly projects?
probably even more so the historical journalistic side of research. I become fascinated. And it's really out of my comfort zone. It's not an area I've done a lot in. Before I came into this particular part of my work, I was doing neuroscience research. It's a whole different kind of writing. And so I'm finding my way. And so what I would say is bring folks around you. I mean, it's those Friday mornings are probably the most um, beneficial thing to for me in terms of the research. Having a team, people that you relate to, and can inspire and encourage, and sort of as a sounding board to help shape ideas. And so bringing those around you, being willing to take risks in doing something different, and collaborating. I think those are keys.
You know, it's fascinating. The first Zoom fatigue busting session was with Sandy Burge. And it was very striking how much my conversations with her ended up with collaborate with others, have people give you ideas, give
Mm-hmm.
yourself permission to try things outside of your comfort zone. And it's just fascinating that we're coming around full circle again, that connection and relationship with others is so important for our professional
Yeah,
growth.
I would have never thought I'd been this inspired by this kind of research. And I know it takes a little more time, and it takes so much more energy for reflection. Um, and, I'm inspired by folks who are working with pictures like up in East Lansing and doing research around this more creative kind of reflective story building, storytelling kinds of things. And as much as I had done so much of that other very quantitative kind of research, I just think there's more. There's some fun to that, and I hope others get inspired on that kind of work. Um, it could feel a little fuzzier, if I could say it that way, a little harder to put your arms around at times. But in many ways, the story of our journey in behavioral medicine within family medicine has been that. It started off in this very creative, revolutionary kind of idea.
Mhm.
And many of those who've been our movers and shakers have been those very big picture, big story kind of things. They haven't always been the quantitative um, kinds of things. That both are needed.
Right, right. And I am super excited to continue to watch and see what comes out of your project. So thank you.